Fallout New Vegas 2 may be actually happening. This is an interesting one, as we've recently heard how there may be very early talks at Obsidian to actually make a Fallout New Vegas 2. And although I typically wouldn't cover this type of rumor, based off of its source, this is perhaps one of the most credible versions of a leak or rumor like this that we've really ever gotten. So what is going on here is Jeff Grubb, who's a games journalist or a writer for GamesBeat, but then also has a variety of his own platforms where he shares info, live streams, and most notably here, he does have a premium podcast that with Grub Snacks on Giant Bomb. And yes, this is a podcast behind a membership, but honestly, a lot of stuff, a lot of the insider things he shares are actually shared during this podcast, so it's not the worst membership to pick up. As you can imagine, on a recent episode of this podcast, Jeff Grubb did say this.
Very early. This is very early, but people have begun to have talks and say these words in sentences, and those words are Obsidian and New Vegas 2. I will say that there's at least an interest and conversations being had about making something like that actually a reality.
I encourage you guys to check this out for yourselves, and there are links down below. The larger context here is following the Bethesda acquisition by Microsoft. There's the situation where Microsoft now owns both the Fallout IP and Obsidian, and as Jeff Grubb describes later during this podcast, Bethesda Game Studios is extremely busy. They have Starfield and the Elder Scrolls 6, so as a result, conversations have started popping up around Obsidian and Fallout in Obsidian's future, mainly because BGS is just too busy to actually make Fallout a reality in Bethesda's future. So before we dive into this further, it definitely seems like a good point to stop and say, okay, but can we actually trust what Jeff Grubb is saying? Is he that trustworthy of a source? Does he know things? Does he get things right? Over the past 2 years, he has become one of the more prominent insiders, leaking things on games, and does have a mixed but very strong track record. He correctly predicted the stream we saw between Bethesda and Microsoft after the purchase actually went through, and specifically he predicted that it wouldn't really be a full-on event, but more of a business-oriented talk. Other people are predicting more of an event with trailers, and obviously that's not what we got. He leaked that Horizon Forbidden West would be delayed into 2022. He correctly predicted the existence and release year of Mass Effect Legendary Edition. He correctly predicted the announcement of Street Fighter 6 just a couple of weeks ago. He correctly leaked that Starfield would be a PC and Xbox exclusive. Okay, that one's not that impressive, but still, he did get that right. He correctly predicted that Battlefield 2042 would be delayed just days before the delay announcement. And overall, as you can see from this, these are just a few examples of things he's gotten right somewhat recently. Obviously, there's a bunch of other predictions out there, but we don't yet know if they're right or wrong. But his track record isn't perfect. He's definitely gotten things wrong. Like at one point he said that Xbox Live Gold was going away, and he's gotten several things wrong around Elden Ring earlier last year. But in general, when he makes hard predictions, when he's actually calling something out or stating it as a fact, people tend to believe him and listen to him because he's been very right thus far. So with that in mind, when he says Obsidian is in talks to work on New Vegas 2, potentially, I actually believe him. But this is a pretty complicated situation, an interesting one overall. Obviously, Bethesda is pretty busy. That's why this entire thing is arising. We've heard time and time again how Todd Howard was planning to keep Fallout in-house. I wouldn't be shocked if this is the larger Microsoft body being like, okay, that's cool, but we'd also like Fallout games to keep coming out. If you look at Bethesda Game Studios right now, we hopefully are getting Starfield later this year. Then we have another 3 to 4 years of dev time on the Elder Scrolls 6. And then at that point, they could potentially start on a Fallout 5, which would likely be another 3 years at best of dev time. And that's assuming they don't do something like a Starfield 2, which considering how much hype and anticipation is going to Starfield, you could definitely see them wanting to return to that game. So this hypothetical overall says a best case scenario for a Fallout 5 is a 2028 release date. So it makes complete sense for Microsoft to start looking around at the other studios, and Obsidian have the immediate it factor, thanks to the fact that they made what many people would consider to be the best Fallout game ever. But there's still a couple of issues here. On one hand, many of the people that made Fallout New Vegas have simply moved on from Obsidian at this point. It's been a decade since the game's original release, and the big names behind the project literally just don't work here anymore, or at least most of them, as there is one very prominent holdout, that with one of the directors on Fallout New Vegas with Josh Sawyer, who's reportedly wrapping up a smaller game right now at Obsidian. It's It's rumored this smaller game with a smaller team will be coming out later in 2022, but technically we don't even know the name of it, let alone a release date. Sawyer, being the former director of New Vegas, could make him a perfect candidate here, and especially as he may have a game coming out shortly, but he has talked about being tired of the AAA machine as he described it and wants to work on smaller projects and smaller teams. And he recently gave a talk about how smaller teams and smaller projects will be the future of the industry for many devs. His upcoming game is supposedly a non-combat RPG. You don't actually fight anybody in this, and rumored to be a murder mystery game with experimental mechanics. A Fallout game would certainly be a massive departure from that, but at the same time, in 2017, he did say, "I would certainly love to work on a Fallout game again." And one of the other issues around Obsidian is, just like Bethesda, they're actually really busy. It seems like Obsidian right now is working on 4 separate projects. Grounded, which is already released in early access, but still getting development. We of course do have Josh Sawyer's project, whatever that is. Avowed as a massive AAA project, as well as The Outer Worlds 2, which also seems to be a relatively massive AAA project. So they actually technically have more on their plate, at least officially, compared to what Bethesda's working on right now. We heard from Jez Corden, another insider, that Obsidian has a goal to release a game every year through 2028, and this could create a pretty interesting timeline. Josh Sawyer's game is rumored to be releasing later this year in 2022. Jez Corden also leaked recently that Avowed may be coming as soon as Q1 or Q2 2023. And really, in general, Avowed coming in 2023 does seem quite plausible. That game's been in development for a long time now. And then The Outer Worlds 2 in 2024 could also be kind of possible. This does seem pretty early for it, and especially 1 year after Avowed ships does seem pretty ambitious, but the game reportedly has 70 devs on it already, and we know work on The Outer Worlds 2 actually started, at least on a pre-production level, before The Outer Worlds 1 even released. This game has had several years of dev time already, at least to some degree. We obviously don't know how intense the work has been, and you can definitely start to see the roadmap here. Start pre-production in a year after Josh Sawyer finishes his game, and he seems like the most obvious director choice. And then the teams move to full production as Avowed and/or The Outer Worlds 2 releases. And with that in mind, we could see a Fallout New Vegas 2 or new Fallout game from Obsidian coming out in the mid to late 2020s, maybe around 2025 to 2027. But it definitely seems like on the earlier side could be possible, which definitely beats out Bethesda's timeline by a couple of years, but this also does open up the opportunity for Bethesda to do something like Starfield 2, which they certainly could be interested in, especially with how much hype and anticipation there is from the studio around Starfield 1. There also is this question as to why a Fallout New Vegas 2. I imagine some of you are wondering this entire time, why wouldn't they just make a new Fallout like Fallout California? Why is it New Vegas 2? And I think the reality is that's just kind of become a fan naming of a Obsidian-made Fallout. I don't think many people expect them to make a direct sequel to Fallout New Vegas, but rather, similar to all the other Fallouts, a new game taking place in a new location, probably on the West Coast, because that's what Obsidian has liked. In fact, we actually heard back in 2013 from the CEO of Obsidian what they would do in a New Vegas 2 when asked, because yes, they were being asked this question all the way back in 2013. If I think of going from Fallout 1 to Fallout 2, we tried to associate the two areas somewhat closely. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to do this 2,000 miles from here. So I think if we were to do a Fallout New Vegas 2 or just a new Fallout, we would probably separate it from the internal team at Bethesda's doing. We'd keep it on the West Coast because we're West Coast people. They're East Coast, so it makes sense. And we need an interesting confined area. So I mean, it could be LA, Fallout LA. That could be interesting. It'd probably be the Boneyard, which is from Fallout 1. It could be very different. It could be almost Walking Dead meets Fallout like thing because of all the radiation. So overall, all of this is still very early on and very far out, but it seems like something that just makes a ton of sense. The New Vegas director making another Fallout game is something fans would literally gush over. Bethesda isn't able to actively use the IP for new games, at least in the near future, and I'm sure Microsoft wants to keep things monetized, especially as we are literally going to be getting a Fallout TV show in the next few years here. Assuming Todd Howard's fine with somebody else actually using their IP, although technically it's not up to him anymore, this really just seems like one of those scenarios where it's a win-win-win. The Fallout IP gets used, fans are happy that Obsidian's returning to Fallout, and of course Microsoft collects those checks when this inevitably makes a boatload of money. And it is actually worth mentioning at this point that this is in fact not the first time we've heard someone say that someone else would be working on the next Fallout game. In mid-2021, Dealer Gaming, who's another YouTuber, said this:
2 unannounced Unreal Engine 5 RPGs from In Exile, and I've heard at least one of them is Fallout. Yes, I've mentioned this multiple times over my own videos and podcasts. This was something I was told some time ago, and remember, Brian Fargo and company were the ones who actually built up the Fallout IP, eventually selling it to Bethesda, yes, when they were known as Interplay.
Dealer doesn't have the same track record as Jeff Grubb, but he still has gotten some predictions right. And it is interesting to see 2 completely isolated and separate sources talking about this. Now, of course, In Exile as well as Unreal Engine seems very unlikely compared to Obsidian and probably Creation Engine 2, but perhaps Microsoft was shopping this idea around to some of their other studios, and that's where this rumor comes from. Either way, it's definitely a very interesting and exciting situation. I'm sure for some people, this is one of those scenarios where it gets you more excited for the future. Some people are tired of the Bethesda Fallouts, and they would love to see another company give this IP a go. Either way, we may not hear anything more about this for literal years, but at the very least, we should have a lot of content coming with both Starfield and potentially Avowed coming in the next year, which would be absolutely insane. As always, again, I thank you all for watching. I do hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.